I looked at Thomas for several seconds before answering. The ballroom around us continued to hum with polite conversation, the quiet clink of glasses, and the soft music of the quartet drifting across the polished floor. Nothing in the room suggested that anything unusual was happening, yet Thomas's question had landed with the weight of something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding. I folded my hands calmly in front of me and said, very clearly, that I had not authorized any transfer connected to the wedding. Thomas nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. His eyes moved briefly across the room again, pausing on the tables, the band, the elaborate floral arrangements, and finally the towering wedding cake beside us. When he spoke again, his voice remained gentle, but the careful tone of a man used to handling delicate matters was unmistakable. He explained that 2 weeks earlier a request had been filed through the family trust account established by my late husband Arthur. According to the paperwork, the funds had been approved for what the document described as final wedding expenses. The amount was not small. Thomas said the transfer had been exactly $120,000. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening to the music, watching a group of guests laugh near the bar as though the evening were unfolding exactly as planned. $120,000. I had known the wedding would be expensive. Olivia had been very clear about the type of celebration she wanted. But every major payment I had made had come directly from my own account, and each of those checks had been written months earlier. I asked Thomas who had authorized the request. He told me the paperwork had arrived with Daniel's signature attached to the digital authorization line. My son. The same son who had looked at my name tag across the room and then quietly looked away. I felt no sudden anger, no dramatic rush of emotion. At my age, reactions arrived differently. Instead, I felt a slow, careful rearranging of thoughts, like puzzle pieces shifting into place one by one. For years, small moments had passed that I had chosen not to question too closely. Invitations that never arrived. Holiday dinners scheduled without telling me until the last minute. Family photographs posted online that somehow never included me. Each time, there had been a polite explanation, usually delivered with a reassuring smile. Olivia had been particularly good at that kind of explanation. She always sounded thoughtful, always concerned, always ready with a reason why circumstances had simply worked out that way. Standing beside the cake table, I began to see those moments differently. Perhaps they had not been accidents at all. Thomas studied my face carefully, perhaps expecting a stronger reaction. When none came, he said quietly that he had attempted to contact Daniel earlier in the week to confirm the authorization, but had received only a brief reply stating that the matter had already been approved by the family. Approved by the family. I glanced across the ballroom again. Daniel was now speaking with Olivia and her mother Caroline near the center of the room. All three of them appeared relaxed, smiling as they greeted arriving guests. The three of them formed a small circle that seemed to exist just slightly apart from everyone else. I asked Thomas one more question. I asked him whether the trust documentation required my signature for a transfer of that size. Thomas did not hesitate. He said that according to Arthur's original instructions, any withdrawal exceeding $20,000 required 2 approvals. The trustee and me. Thomas was the trustee. I was the second approval, and I had never signed anything. I thanked Thomas quietly and told him that the evening was not the right place for a long legal discussion, but that I appreciated him telling me the truth. He gave a small nod, the kind that passes between people who understand that patience often reveals more than confrontation. Then he stepped away into the crowd, leaving me standing beside the wedding cake with a calm expression and a mind that had begun to move much faster than anyone around me would have guessed. I walked slowly toward one of the round tables near the back of the ballroom and sat down. From that seat, I could see almost the entire room. The chandeliers shimmered above the dance floor. The musicians adjusted their sheet music while guests settled into chairs and waiters refilled glasses. Everything looked exactly like the elegant celebration Olivia had dreamed about. Yet beneath the polished surface I could now see something else entirely. The name tag pinned to my jacket no longer felt like a careless insult. It felt like part of a larger story. Someone had decided that tonight I would appear unnecessary. Someone had decided that the grandmother who had quietly written checks for months would appear to be a distant relative who barely attended family gatherings. I rested my hands lightly on the tablecloth and watched Daniel again. He stood near the stage speaking with the wedding coordinator while Olivia and her mother Caroline greeted guests. Caroline's smile moved easily from one conversation to another, the same polished smile she had used for years whenever she needed to smooth over an awkward situation. For a long time I had believed that smile meant kindness. Now I began to suspect it meant something else entirely. A memory returned to me from nearly a year earlier, when Olivia first mentioned the wedding plans over Sunday lunch at my house. She had been very enthusiastic that afternoon, spreading magazine pages across my dining table and describing venues, flowers, photographers, and music. At one point she had laughed and said, almost casually, that weddings were expensive but that the family would figure it out together. I remembered telling her not to worry. I told her that family celebrations were meant to be shared and that her grandfather would have loved to see her happy. I had meant every word of that. What I had not realized at the time was how easily generosity can be mistaken for weakness. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally noticed me again. This time his expression lingered for a moment longer. His eyes moved once more to the name tag on my jacket before he glanced away toward Caroline. She leaned slightly toward him and said something I could not hear. Daniel gave a small nod. The three of them exchanged quick looks that lasted only a second before their smiles returned for the surrounding guests. It was a brief moment, but it confirmed something important. They knew exactly what was written on my jacket. They knew exactly how it would appear to everyone else in the room. I reached up calmly and touched the edge of the card pinned to my lapel. The absent old lady. The phrase was clever in its own quiet way. It suggested that I had simply failed to be present for the family over the years, that I had chosen distance, that I had missed birthdays, holidays, and milestones. By my own choice. Anyone reading the tag would assume the title reflected a harmless family joke. The truth, of course, was much simpler. I had been present for nearly every moment that mattered. I had been present when Olivia learned to ride her first bicycle on the cracked pavement behind my house. I had been present when Daniel called me late one night asking for help with his first mortgage payment. I had been present when Caroline needed a loan to start the small boutique she now proudly called her own business. Presence, I realized, is often remembered differently by the people who benefit from it. As the lights dimmed slightly and the music shifted into the opening notes that signaled the beginning of the reception speeches, I folded my hands in my lap and looked calmly toward the stage. Whoever had planned this little title for me believed the evening would unfold exactly the way they expected. What they did not know yet was that the story behind this wedding had already begun to change. The first speech of the evening began a few minutes later when the wedding coordinator gently tapped the microphone and invited everyone to take their seats. Conversations softened across the ballroom as chairs moved and guests turned their attention toward the small stage near the dance floor. I remained seated at my table near the back of the room, my posture straight, my hands folded neatly in front of me. From where I sat I could see Olivia and her new husband standing together near the head table, smiling as the best man stepped forward to speak. The applause that followed his introduction was warm and sincere, the kind that always fills a wedding reception with a sense of shared celebration. For several minutes the speech continued with stories about college days, late-night road trips, and the moment the groom first mentioned Olivia's name to his friends. The guests laughed in all the right places. Olivia held Daniel's arm and leaned her head lightly against his shoulder while cameras flashed from different corners of the room. It was a beautiful performance. I watched it carefully, noticing the way Caroline glanced toward the tables every so often, as though checking that every detail of the evening remained under control. Control, I realized, had always mattered very much to her. Years earlier, when Daniel first introduced Caroline to the family, she had impressed everyone with her confidence. She spoke about plans, opportunities, business ideas, and the importance of presenting the right image to the world. I had admired that confidence at the time. It seemed like ambition. Now, sitting quietly beneath the soft light of the chandeliers, I began to understand that image had always been more important to her than truth. The best man finished his speech and the room erupted into applause again. The microphone was then passed to Daniel, who stood slowly and adjusted his jacket with the calm ease of someone accustomed to speaking in front of a crowd. My son had always been good with words. When he began to talk about family, about gratitude, and about the people who had helped make the evening possible, the audience listened with warm attention. He thanked the wedding planner, the musicians, the catering staff, and even the photographer who had traveled several hundred miles to capture the day. I noticed that he also thanked Caroline for her guidance and support during the planning process. The room responded with another round of polite applause. Daniel paused for a moment, smiling toward the head table, and then he said something that made the quiet space around my chair feel suddenly much larger. He told the guests that the entire wedding had been made possible by the hard work and dedication of their immediate family. He spoke proudly about how everyone had come together to make the celebration a reality. As he spoke those words, his eyes moved briefly across the tables until they landed on me for just a second. It was a quick glance, almost invisible to anyone who was not watching closely. But I had been watching closely all evening. There was something uncertain in that look, something that lasted only long enough for him to confirm that I had heard every word. Then he continued his speech as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Around the ballroom, people nodded with approval, believing they were listening to a sincere expression of family gratitude. I sat very still, listening carefully to every sentence. The title pinned to my jacket rested quietly against the fabric, its thin edge barely noticeable beneath the soft light of the chandeliers. The absent old lady. It was a clever phrase, especially now that Daniel had publicly described the wedding as the result of everyone's shared effort. The story they were telling the room was becoming clearer with each passing minute. In that story, I was not the woman who had written checks for flowers, music, and deposits months earlier. In that story, I was simply a relative who rarely appeared, someone who had drifted quietly to the edge of the family circle. As Daniel finished his speech and the applause rose once again, I lifted my eyes toward the stage and allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile. Because the more carefully I listened to their version of events, the more certain I became that they had forgotten something very important about the truth. The applause from Daniel's speech slowly faded into the gentle hum of conversation as guests returned to their meals and the musicians prepared for the next piece. I remained seated at my table, my hands still folded neatly in front of me, watching the movement across the ballroom with the same quiet attention I had held all evening. The story Daniel had just told the room lingered in the air like perfume. A story about family unity. A story about shared effort. A story where everyone had contributed equally to the celebration unfolding beneath the crystal chandeliers. It was a carefully chosen version of events, polished and pleasant, the kind of version people enjoy hearing at weddings. Around me, several guests nodded approvingly while waiters carried plates from the kitchen. I heard someone at a nearby table say that it was wonderful to see a family so supportive of one another. I did not interrupt their conversation. I simply listened. Because the more I listened, the more the evening began to make sense. Across the ballroom, Olivia and Caroline stood near the head table greeting relatives who had come forward to offer congratulations. Caroline's smile moved easily from one guest to another, graceful and practiced. Every so often her eyes swept briefly across the room, as though she were checking that every part of the celebration remained exactly as she had planned. When her gaze reached my table, it paused for just a moment on the name tag pinned to my jacket. Then her expression returned smoothly to the polite warmth she offered the surrounding guests. That small glance told me something important. She was aware of the title I had been given. She was aware of how it would be interpreted, and she was satisfied that the evening was unfolding exactly the way she had expected. I lifted my water glass slowly and took a small sip while considering everything Thomas had told me earlier beside the wedding cake. $120,000 transferred from a trust account that required my approval. A transfer I had never authorized. The detail remained quietly in my thoughts like a stone resting at the bottom of a clear lake. The longer I considered it, the clearer the water around it became. I remembered the way Olivia had encouraged me months earlier to let her and Daniel handle the final payments for the venue. She had insisted it would be easier for everyone if the last arrangements came directly from the family account. At the time, I had not questioned her enthusiasm. Weddings often involve complicated finances, and Olivia had sounded eager to manage the final details herself. Now I understood how convenient that suggestion had been. At the head table, Daniel was now laughing with one of his friends, his hand resting lightly on Olivia's shoulder as they spoke. The room continued to glow with celebration. Waiters poured champagne. Guests shared stories and compliments about the ceremony that had taken place earlier that afternoon beside the lake. Everything appeared exactly as it should at a joyful wedding reception. Yet beneath the music and the laughter, I felt a quiet certainty settling into place. Whoever had planned the story being told tonight believed the truth would remain invisible once enough people heard the polished version. They believed the grandmother sitting quietly at the back of the room would simply accept the role written for her. I reached up once more and touched the edge of the card pinned neatly to my jacket. The absent old lady. The phrase still looked delicate in its elegant script, but its meaning had begun to change. Because the truth about absence is very simple. Someone can only disappear from a story if the people telling it control the ending. And as I looked toward the stage where the next speech was about to begin, I realized that the ending of this evening had not been decided yet. The next speech began a few minutes later when Olivia's mother Caroline stepped forward and accepted the microphone with the same polished confidence she had carried all evening. The room quieted again as guests turned their chairs toward the stage. Caroline smiled warmly, thanking everyone for attending and speaking about how proud she was of Olivia and the beautiful life she was beginning. Her voice was smooth and steady, practiced in the way people sound when they know exactly how an audience will respond. She spoke about family traditions, about support, about how love and hard work had brought everyone together on this special day. The words floated easily through the ballroom, filling the space with a comfortable story that the guests seemed happy to believe. I listened carefully to every sentence. Caroline described long months of planning, the excitement of watching the wedding come together piece by piece, and the gratitude she felt for the people who had helped make the evening possible. Several times she used the phrase "our family worked together." Each time the guests responded with approving smiles. I remained seated quietly at my table, my hands resting calmly on the white linen cloth while the soft light from the chandeliers shimmered across the polished silverware. It was almost impressive how smoothly the story was being told. Not once did Caroline mention the checks I had written months earlier for the florist, the musicians, or the venue deposit. Not once did she acknowledge the quiet help that had made many of those early decisions possible. Instead, she spoke as though the entire celebration had emerged from the efforts of the small circle standing near the head table. I noticed Daniel watching her closely as she spoke. Each time she paused, he nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. Olivia stood beside them with her hands folded gracefully in front of her dress, smiling at the applause that followed each sentimental moment in the speech. The three of them looked perfectly composed beneath the warm lights of the stage. When Caroline finally finished her remarks, the room filled again with clapping and laughter. The musicians played a gentle transition piece while waiters began clearing the dinner plates from the tables. For a few minutes, the attention of the guests shifted back to casual conversation and the anticipation of the first dance. I used that moment to stand slowly from my chair. The movement was quiet enough that no one at my table paid much attention. I adjusted the edge of my jacket and smoothed the small card pinned neatly to the lapel. The absent old lady. The elegant script still looked delicate beneath the light. I walked calmly across the ballroom floor, moving between tables where guests were still talking about the speeches. A few people glanced at me politely as I passed, their eyes drifting briefly to the name tag before returning to their conversations. I continued walking until I reached the side of the room where the stage stood only a few steps away. The wedding coordinator was busy speaking with the musicians and did not notice me at first. From where I stood, I could see Olivia clearly. She was laughing again with one of her bridesmaids, completely relaxed now that the speeches were finished. For a moment, I simply watched her, remembering the little girl from the photograph near the entrance who once believed a red balloon could float all the way to the clouds. Time changes many things, but sometimes it reveals truths that were always waiting quietly beneath the surface. After a few seconds, the wedding coordinator turned and noticed me standing there. I gave her a polite smile and asked if I might borrow the microphone for just a moment before the first dance began. She looked slightly surprised but nodded quickly, assuming I was another relative preparing to offer a brief congratulations. As she handed me the microphone, I could see several heads turning across the ballroom. Conversations softened. Daniel's expression shifted when he realized where I was standing. Caroline's smile paused for a fraction of a second before returning to its careful shape. Olivia looked at me with mild curiosity, as though she had not expected the absent old lady to move from her seat at the back of the room. I held the microphone gently in my hand and looked out across the ballroom, letting the quiet settle naturally over the room. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in any story is the moment just before the truth is finally spoken. I waited until the quiet settled fully across the ballroom before I spoke. The microphone felt light in my hand, far lighter than the moment itself. Dozens of faces looked toward the stage with polite curiosity, expecting perhaps another sentimental blessing or a grandmother's gentle congratulations. I offered them a small calm smile before beginning. I said that weddings are beautiful occasions because they remind us of something very simple, that families are built on memory, trust, and truth. My voice carried easily through the room, steady and unhurried. I said that watching Olivia grow up had been one of the great joys of my life, and that seeing her standing there tonight in her wedding dress was something her grandfather Arthur would have been proud to witness. A few guests nodded warmly at those words. Olivia herself smiled politely, still unsure why I had stepped forward. I continued by saying that family stories are powerful things. When they are told often enough, people begin to believe them completely. Sometimes those stories are beautiful. Sometimes they are convenient. I paused briefly and reached up, gently touching the small card pinned to my jacket so everyone could see it. The absent old lady. A few quiet murmurs moved through the audience as more guests finally noticed the words written there. I said that I found the title interesting. I said that perhaps it was meant as a joke, or perhaps as a clever way to describe someone who had not been present for the important moments in a family's life. Then I said that titles only matter when they reflect the truth. I explained calmly that for the past year I had attended many planning meetings for this wedding. I described how Olivia and I had sat at my dining table looking through photographs of flower arrangements. I described how we had chosen the musicians together and how excited she had been when she found the bakery that created the cake standing just a few feet away from the stage. As I spoke, I noticed Daniel shifting slightly in his seat. Caroline's smile had become very still. I told the guests that I believed family celebrations should be supported when we are able to help. That is why I had written checks months earlier for the venue deposit, the musicians, and the florist. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the tables as several people turned to look toward the stage more closely. I then explained something else. Earlier that evening, I had learned that a transfer of $120,000 had been requested from the family trust created by my late husband. According to the documentation, that transfer required two approvals: the trustee and me. I said that I had never signed such an approval. The ballroom had grown very still now. I looked toward Daniel for a moment before continuing. I said that misunderstandings can happen in families, and that tonight was not the place for legal discussions. However, I believed it was important that the story of this wedding remain honest. I gently removed the card from my jacket and held it up so everyone could read it again. The absent old lady. I smiled slightly and said that perhaps absence had been misunderstood. Presence is not always measured by who speaks the loudest during a celebration. Sometimes it is measured by quiet support given long before the music begins. I placed the name tag carefully on the podium beside the microphone and wished Olivia and her husband a long and happy life together. Then I thanked the guests for sharing such a memorable evening. I handed the microphone back to the wedding coordinator and stepped down from the stage while the room remained wrapped in a thoughtful silence that said far more than applause ever could.